people follow him out there. Mark and Matthew tell us that it was a very solitary and remote place. And then John says Jesus sat down with his disciples. Mark also tells us that Jesus began to teach, and he taught for most of that day. And apparently, as the day wore on, the question that began to occur in the minds of the disciples was, where are all of these people going to find something to eat out here in the middle of nowhere? And this is where our passage echoes the Old Testament for the very first time. You see, the people had followed Jesus. They had wandered out into the wilderness. And they found there that they didn't have anything to eat. And it's like a replay of Moses and the Israelites. The Israelites followed Moses out of Egypt and into the wilderness, and when they got there, they too had nothing to eat. But if we remember that story, as we're reading, we remember that God provided for them. Provided manna or bread from heaven. We're reminded of God's character, that He provides for those who trust in Him. And the question for us is, do we believe that? Do we really believe that God will provide for us? Now, clearly, I was thinking about this passage. Clearly, none of these people who were following Jesus that day were from EPC. Because the one thing that we would never forget is food at a church event. I'm really sure that I couldn't even drag any of you out there without the lure of a meal or a snack or the very least, which would be coffee and a cookie. And as we're thinking, yeah, amen. Yeah. I don't get a lot of amens, but that's the... Yeah. We should also remember that in this time, it's not like they had Costco, you know? It wasn't some giant warehouse to go and buy food at. And even if there was, can you imagine over 5,000 people trying to jam their way into Costco? It'd be like Saturday at Costco times 10 or 20. I was there at Costco yesterday, so I know. I saw Nagi. He had to move on because we couldn't even talk. There were too many people. And then I saw Kim, and Dave was supposedly with you, but we never saw him. He was just lost in the sea of people. And the thing is, not only did they not have Costco, but it doesn't appear in this passage that they were anywhere near any kind of town or village where they might buy food. Now with verse 4, John reminds us that the Passover feast is near. And it seems just like this extra detail that John puts in there. But it's our second allusion to the Old Testament. It reminds us of the story of the Passover and of the Passover meal. The Passover celebration was the celebration of the Exodus, of the fact that God led His people out of slavery in Egypt and into freedom, into the promised land. And if we remember that story in the Passover meal, we again remember that God provides. And it's kind of like John is saying, really? Do you really believe that? Do you really believe that God provides? Because a lot of people say that they do, and then live in a way that doesn't evidence that at all. Is that us? Well, at this point in verse 5, with a hungry crowd heading right towards them, Jesus says to Philip, one of the disciples, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" Now Jesus was just naming the question that they all had on their mind. And it was really natural to direct the question to Philip, because we know that Philip actually lived right in that area. So they were probably already all kind of looking to Philip, thinking that if there was an answer, Philip would know that answer. But Jesus makes one small change from the way that they were probably thinking about the question. You see, Jesus doesn't say to them, to Philip, "Where shall these people buy bread to eat?" Philip says to them, "Where will we buy bread for these people to eat?" Jesus takes this massive problem and He puts it right on their backs. Now, Philip is no fool, and he grasps what Jesus is doing immediately. And he responds to Jesus in verse 7. And he says, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. There's no place out here to buy bread. And even if there was, we don't have the money. Philip's response was basically, it can't be done, Jesus. It can't be done. But notice in verse 6, it says that Jesus asked Philip this question as a test. And in fact, Jesus already knew what he was going to do. You see, we need to remember that as Jesus was traveling around and preaching and teaching, he was also training the disciples. Training them not just for ministry, but he was training them in faith. And so now, after he's tutored them for a while, he decides it's time to give a test and see what they've learned. And although the question is directed at Philip, it's really for all of them. And honestly, it's kind of a hard one. Where do you find food for all of these people out in the middle of nowhere? Well, you don't. Unless you're traveling with the Lord. And that is the key. You see, the question that Jesus was asking them was not really about bread at all. The question that Jesus was asking them was, do you believe that God will provide? Do you believe that I, Jesus, have things in hand? Do you believe it? Do we believe that? Well, if we do, then why do we worry so much about everything? And why do we get so stressed out about school and work and family and all of our obligations as if God's not going to provide for us? Why do we do those things if we say with our lips that we believe that God will provide? Well, at this point, Andrew takes a shot at the test. Verse 8. I've always liked Andrew. I kind of imagine that Andrew's sort of an upbeat, kind of happy person. And the reason for that is most of the time when Andrew appears in the Bible, he's bringing someone to Jesus. And it's usually a really good thing. And in this case, true to form, Andrew is bringing a small boy to Jesus. And in verse 9, he reports that this small boy has 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And he reports this kind of enthusiastically, but as he says it, it seems like his enthusiasm sort of starts to wane a little bit as he realizes just how big the task at hand is. And so he adds on the end of his statement, but how far will they go among so many people? And right here for the 3rd time, our passage echoes, and maybe the most clearly, the Old Testament. You see, in 2 Kings, there's a story about a man who comes to the prophet Elisha. And he brings Elisha 20 loaves of barley bread and a few ears of grain as an offering to the prophet. And there's a famine in the land, so Elisha tells the man to go and to give the loaves to the people who are assembled there. And the man protests. And he says to Elisha, how can I set this before 100 men? Meaning it won't be enough. But Elisha tells him to go and to do it anyways, saying that the Lord said, they will eat and have some left over. So the man does what he's told. He goes and he gives the 20 loaves of bread to the over 100 people. Just counting the men, it was 100. And it says that the people ate and there was food left over just as God had promised. And again, we're reminded of God's character. Again, we are reminded that God provides. And again, we have to consider the question, do we believe that? Do we believe that God will provide for us? And if we do believe that, then why are we so hesitant again and again to step out into places where we have to rely on God to provide for us? Why are we so afraid to go on a mission trip or to give a testimony or to teach a Sunday school class or to up our giving or to give some of our time or employ our talents? Why do we get so afraid? if we say that we know God will provide? Why personally are we so afraid to take risks, and why as a congregation do we get so scared about trying something new? Do we really believe that God will provide for us? Or are those just nice religious words that we say? Well, now, obviously, Andrew had been doing some checking around to see what he could come up with, and he knew that what he'd found wasn't a lot, but he put it out there anyways. And I like that about Andrew. It's like he's saying to Jesus, I know this isn't much, Jesus, but I'm just going to give you what I have, and I'm going to trust you with it. And as deflated as Andrew kind of was in that moment, he was really on the right track. Rather than assuming that his finite resources weren't going to amount to anything, Andrew kind of has this kind of glimmer of an idea that with Jesus there may be hope. But even for Andrew, right in this moment, that's more of a vague notion than it is of a heartfelt conviction. So Jesus, realizing that these disciples of his are really struggling with all of this, decides to lay out the answer to the test in a kind of a teaching moment. He decides to do what he's been planning to do all along. And he begins by instructing them to have the people lie down. Have the people sit down in the grass. But the Greek word there for sit down, it means literally to recline or to lie down. So Jesus tells them to lie down in the grass. And right there we have our fourth allusion to the Old Testament, to the 23rd Psalm. Because in the